life change. Sometimes we have one big testimony of life change, and that occasionally is accompanied by a baptism. And tonight we have both. We have an amazing transformational life change story and a full immersion baptism. And so we are going to have Melayna come up at this time and share her testimony with you before we baptize her into the faith community. Come on up. Give her some support.
Okay, so I'm awful speaking in front of people. So my story starts out pretty normal. I grew up an only child with only my mother. Although she did it all on her own, I had an amazing life. I had everything I needed and more. At the age of about 8, my mother met and married my now father. At this point, I also had my real father step back into my life. I had always dreamed of having brothers and sisters, but never did I dream I would gain 4 in a single year. In 1 year, my entire world changed. I grew to love my new families very much, but this caused internal damage that I wasn't aware of until just recently. Because of this drastic change, I started to feel unwanted or pushed to the side. During my early teens, I started to look for a fill to this hole in all the wrong places. I remember going to my dad's for the summer at 13 and experiencing cigarettes and alcohol for the first time. This is just the start to a later resentment of my father. At the age of 15, I started drinking and smoking and getting into minor trouble in school, and I was actually suspended for 10 days for drinking in school. Throughout my years of high school, I was also always drinking and partying. I remember drinking so much that I would black out and not know where I was. At the age of 17, I started getting into a different kind of trouble. I stopped going around those who loved me and found a different group of friends. I met a guy through a new friend of mine. They were slightly older than me and had many things going for them. They had their own place, a job, and my soon-to-be husband had a young child. The fact that I could have a family with him was very appealing to me, and it made me feel whole again. I then moved out of my parents' house. I struggled with finishing high school, and although I graduated a year late, I did receive my high school diploma. Within a year of being out of my parents' house, I was married and had a child on the way. At about 7 months along, we were in a wreck. I was admitted into the hospital to check on my baby boy, and although I was in a great deal of pain, my son was okay. In July of 2010, I gave birth to my special little boy, Bentley. I was then living on my own, just my husband and our kids, and the partying started out simple enough, or so I thought. I started noticing my husband acting weird, and I was also then seen by a doctor for the injuries from my wreck. I was put on a heavy amount of narcotics each month, so at this point my husband and I were always using. I didn't think much of it at the time, but this led to further problems. Like I said, I noticed him acting weird, staying up all night, and he swore he saw people outside. As I pushed further into what was going on, he let me in on his secret. He was using meth. I was against it at first, but he convinced me trying it would be okay. I would only need a little to give me energy during the day to be the perfect housewife I needed to be, right? And at first, that's all I did, but as many know, meth is an awful drug that lures you in. Several months later, just a small amount wasn't good enough anymore, and at this point, my method of use escalated. Everything went downhill from there. Just a few months after that, I graduated to heroin. My family was falling apart due to our overwhelming usage. Easter of 2011, my husband and I split and entered rehab. We had lost everything, and I felt like the worst mother on earth. I went to Carroll Jones and moved in with my parents after completing. Although I had slowed down drastically, I had never given up using. I started going to college and was making a life for my son and I again, but sadly I didn't want to give up on my husband. So eventually we got back together and tried to make it work. I wanted my child to grow up knowing his father since I didn't get that chance till later years. Shortly after us getting back together, everything started up again. We were living with his dad who would hand us his narcotics free of charge, so we were always using. This is when the physical abuse started. Although he had always shown controlling patterns, this is when it got bad. He started using meth again. He already had paranoid thinking and was diagnosed as schizophrenic, so he always thought I was doing something wrong. And I soon found out I was pregnant again. This obviously came as a surprise, but we were excited. I thought maybe this would change him. What I'm about to say, I'm deeply ashamed of. But I used narcotics the entire time I was pregnant with my daughter, while my husband secretly used meth. He thought I didn't know, but I did. Our addiction grew more every day, as well as the abuse. By the time I was almost full term, we were living on our own again, and my husband's thoughts had taken over him. It got to the point of him beating me daily. Even being almost full term, I remember him knocking me unconscious with a black eye so bad that the blood poured down into my chin. I had my daughter, Jayliana, in May of 2013. She was beautiful and a dream come true. My husband was there for the birth, but after 2 days, he was done and ready to go home. Causing a huge scene, he forced them to send us home, and we stopped by a friend's house that night. Within a couple months after having my daughter, we were right back where we were 2 years prior. At this point, my mom started fighting us for custody, and sadly, I just gave in. The day I signed those papers was the day I gave up. I was so lost in drugs that I didn't know what day it was. My husband and I then moved to a different town, just him and I. This place was awful. It was also the middle of winter. We lived off a tiny wooden stove that would hold no more than 2 small logs of wood. But it was free, and we literally had nowhere else to go. At this point, my husband was so far gone that I literally could not leave his side. I was tied to a bed for 3 days with a knife held to me, and I was raped for most of that time. But at that point, I felt like I deserved it. Everyone in our life had given up on us, so it didn't matter. After 3 days, I was let go from the bind, but one night he tried to kill me. Called his mother and convinced her to let us stay the night. Took a few changes of clothes with me, and the next morning I called the only person I knew to call to get me away. It was my drug dealer. I convinced my husband I was going to get drugs for him and would be back. His last words to me were, "If you come back empty-handed, you will die." The next 2 weeks were a blur. I was staying in a house, knowing full well what was going on, but 2 weeks later, 3 different counties in the DEA busted down the door and raided the house. I didn't think anything worse could happen, but I was put in jail for several felonies. And this